Welcome to a real hell hidden behind the glittering sets of the so-called Dream Factory. We like to believe that villains exist only on the silver screen, but the truth is far more terrifying. The most horrifying monsters of Hollywood's golden age wore tailored tuxedos and flashed dazzling smiles at the cameras. While audiences admired their talent, these men were breaking bones, shattering minds, and leaving behind a trail of ruined lives and unsolved crimes. This collection has no room for accidents or misunderstandings, only for those whose very nature was steeped in darkness. We will expose the truth about sadists, killers, and psychopaths whom studio bosses shielded for decades because their evil was profitable. Brace yourself, the masks are about to fall, and you will see the true faces of those whom even the devil himself feared. But before we begin with our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment. Enjoy the show. Wallace Beery. In the history of Hollywood's golden age, it is hard to find a figure more contradictory and unsettling than Wallace Beery, an Academy Award winner and one of MGM's highest-grossing stars of the 1930s. He built his career on the image of a rough-edged bear with a heart of gold, gruff but endlessly loyal and kind. Audiences adored him for his roles in The Champ and Treasure Island, seeing him as the embodiment of strength and decency. Yet the moment the cameras stopped rolling, this screen giant became a man feared even by the most powerful studio executives. Beery was notorious for his volatile, uncontrollable temper, and his behavior on set often crossed the bounds of professional ethics, turning the work of his colleagues into a brutal test of endurance. The darkest rumor to haunt Beery's name for decades is tied to a tragic incident in 1937, the sudden death of popular comedian Ted Healy. According to numerous accounts from contemporaries and later investigations by film historians, a serious confrontation erupted between Healy and Beery at a well-known Los Angeles nightclub. It is widely believed that because of Beery's enormous importance to MGM's profits, the incident was swiftly buried by official channels. Instead of a thorough investigation, the public was offered a convenient version of events framed as an accident, while Wallace Beery was quietly sent on an extended trip abroad. This story became a textbook example of how the Golden Age studio system was willing to protect its most valuable assets at any cost, turning a blind eye to grave misconduct by its biggest stars. Beery's sinister reputation was further reinforced by his treatment of colleagues, especially those unable to stand up to him. His hostility toward his young co-star in The Champ, Jackie Cooper, became legendary. Beery openly resented the child actor's popularity and employed subtle psychological tactics to unsettle the boy during filming. He would deliberately ruin takes or adopt an icy, aggressive demeanor at moments when encouragement was most needed. Those around him described the atmosphere in his presence as a constant state of tension. Even his personal life was shadowed by accusations of tyranny. His first wife, the celebrated Gloria Swanson, later wrote in her memoirs about his unpredictable behavior, which ultimately destroyed their marriage. Wallace Beery lived as an untouchable king of the screen, but behind his success trailed a wake of conflicts and damaged lives. He was a man who believed that stardom granted him the right to dictate terms not only to art, but to morality itself. His biography stands as a cautionary tale of how behind a dazzling Hollywood smile and glittering awards, there can lurk a nature devoid of compromise and compassion. He left behind great films, but also bitter memories for those who knew him beyond the camera's lens. In film history, he remains a stark reminder of how dangerous it is to confuse a screen persona with the real individual, one who can prove far darker and more complex than any fiction. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was widely regarded as one of the greatest actors of his generation, a man whose talent seemed limitless. His performances in Mutiny on the Bounty and The Hunchback of Notre Dame became cornerstones of acting textbooks. On screen, he embodied raw power and tragedy. Off-screen, however, Laughton earned a reputation for having an extraordinarily difficult and oppressive character. His menace was not expressed through physical aggression, as in the case of Beery, but through something far more subtle and unsettling: psychological domination. Laughton was an intellectual giant who wielded his mind as a tool of absolute control, turning any film set into a territory where only his rules applied. Those who worked with Laughton often described the experience as a grueling marathon of psychological survival. He possessed an uncanny ability to instantly detect the vulnerabilities of his colleagues and press on them without mercy. Laughton believed that true art could only be achieved by pushing an actor to the brink of emotional exhaustion. There were documented instances in which he tormented scene partners for hours with petty criticisms and caustic remarks, driving them to the edge of a mental breakdown. In his view, only at that breaking point did an actor stop performing and begin to truly live on camera. For many young performers, however, this method became a lasting trauma, and the atmosphere on set grew thick with fear and uncertainty. Laughton's sinister aura was reinforced by his own deep inner dissatisfaction and melancholy. He despised his appearance and often projected that self-loathing onto the world around him. His perfectionism sometimes bordered on the absurd. He would demand that a scene be reshot dozens of times without offering any explanation, simply savoring his power over the process and the people involved. Studio executives tolerated his behavior because the results were invariably brilliant, but the cost of that brilliance was unbearably high for those living in the shadow of his greatness. Laughton created a kind of vacuum around himself, pulling in anyone who attempted to work with him, stripping them of autonomy and bending them to his dark charisma. Even in his sole directorial effort, the masterpiece The Night of the Hunter, Laughton revealed his bleak inner world. He crafted one of the most frightening films in cinematic history, steeped in an atmosphere of latent menace and nocturnal terror. Actors who worked on the film recalled that Laughton seemed to channel his own dark fantasies into every frame. He was a master of tension so intense it was felt physically. His life stands as a story of how genius can become an instrument of tyranny, and how the pursuit of perfection can transform into a refined form of psychological coercion. Charles Laughton remains in history as one of Hollywood's most unsettling intellectuals, a man whose shadow was far larger than the man himself.
Lawrence Tierney. If there was a man in Hollywood's golden age who embodied pure, unrestrained danger, it was Lawrence Tierney. A star of classic noir films like Dillinger and Born to Kill, Tierney didn't merely play tough men, he brought with him the raw scent of street violence and an atmosphere of constant, unpredictable threat. His reputation within the industry was so ominous that many producers quietly blacklisted him, not for lack of talent, but out of basic self-preservation. Off-screen, Tierney was uncontrollable, turning every public appearance into a potential headline for the crime pages. Tierney's frightening nature revealed itself through a pathological disregard for public order. His biography reads like an endless chain of arrests, detentions, and court appearances. While other stars carefully concealed their transgressions behind studio contracts and publicists, Tierney seemed to openly challenge the entire Hollywood system. He was accused of assaults, barroom brawls, and violent clashes with law enforcement. Witnesses described him as a man who could shift in an instant from calm conversation to explosive rage if he felt even slightly disrespected. This inner darkness made his performances terrifyingly authentic, but it also reduced his real life to chaos and ruin. The actor's sinister aura was amplified by his absolute rejection of authority. On set, Tierney often behaved as if safety rules and professional hierarchy simply did not apply to him. Colleagues recalled that working alongside him felt like standing next to a live bomb with a broken timer. He possessed a heavy, crushing stare and a physical power that intimidated everyone around him. Producers sometimes hired staff whose sole responsibility was to make sure Tierney didn't derail production with yet another incident. He was an inconvenient star, a man who refused to play by the rules of the Dream Factory, choosing instead to remain exactly who he was, someone for whom conflict was a natural state of being. By the late 1950s, Tierney's destructive behavior led to his effective exile from Hollywood. He had become too dangerous and too unpredictable, even for an industry known for its tolerance of excess. His life turned into a cautionary tale of how talent can be consumed by an inner storm. Even decades later, when he made a triumphant return to cinema in Reservoir Dogs, stories of his brutal temperament continued to unsettle younger actors. Lawrence Tierney remains in Hollywood memory as a figure whose menace was not an act, but the very essence of his character. He was a dark reflection of the American dream, a man who, instead of building an empire, chose to burn every bridge, leaving behind only the echo of his furious battles with the world. If Lawrence Tierney embodied explosive chaos, then Clifton Webb represented an entirely different, far more refined and glacial form of menace. Webb burst onto the international film scene at a mature age with his role as Waldo Lydecker in the iconic noir Lorre. His screen persona, impeccably dressed, arrogantly intellectual, armed with flawless manners and venomous wit, was so tightly interwoven with his real-life character that many contemporaries saw no distinction between the two. Webb possessed a rare talent for making those around him feel profoundly inadequate, not through fists, but through icy disdain and words delivered with surgical precision.
Clifton Webb. Webb's sinister aura was built on his absolute, almost physically palpable detachment from human emotion. In Hollywood, he was known as the man of stainless steel. Colleagues recalled that Clifton never sought friendliness. He maintained a deliberate coldness, as though any interaction with ordinary mortals were an exhausting obligation. His misanthropy was not a pose, but a way of life. He could annihilate a young actor's reputation with a single caustic remark spoken in front of producers, without a single muscle twitching in his face. This ability to remain perfectly calm while carrying out a moral execution frightened people far more than open rage ever could. A special place in his ominous biography was occupied by his strange, almost mystical relationship with his mother, Mabel Webb. She accompanied him everywhere, society events, film sets, even on his travels. Their bond was described as a disturbing symbiosis in which his mother was the only person Clifton ever truly allowed into his world. When Mabel died at the age of 91, Webb, already in his 70s, plunged into such theatrical and somber mourning that his friend Sir Noel Coward once remarked with dry irony, "Clifton behaves as though he were orphaned at the age of 2. His demonstrative grief, which lasted for years, carried a peculiar, almost necrophilic undertone that made polite Hollywood shudder. Clifton Webb lived his life like a flawlessly engineered automaton, seemingly incapable of weakness. He was a man who believed in form more than substance, and in etiquette more than compassion. His menace lay in the fact that behind the facade of the perfect gentleman there appeared to be nothing alive, only endless cold and intellectual superiority. He remains in history as a master of refined malevolence, proving that the most terrifying monster is the one dressed in a perfect tuxedo, offering you a glass of champagne with a smile that makes your blood run cold.
Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the living embodiment of Hollywood's ruthless will to power. Her rise from a poor dancer to one of MGM's greatest screen divas became a textbook example of the American success story. Yet behind the blinding glamour and immaculate style lurked a nature whose menace lay in a pathological obsession with control. Crawford was not merely an actress. She was an unrelenting mechanism that demanded absolute submission to her standards. Her pursuit of perfection gradually evolved into a refined form of domestic and professional tyranny, making her one of the most frightening figures behind the scenes of the Golden Age. Joan's dark reputation took on truly sinister contours after the publication of the memoirs written by her adopted daughter, Christina. The world was introduced to the other Joan, a woman who turned her mansion into something resembling a military barracks governed by merciless discipline. The infamous story of the wire hangers became a symbol of her uncontrollable rages. Crawford tolerated no imperfection. A speck of dust, a wrinkle in clothing, or the slightest disruption of routine could trigger hours of psychological punishment. She used her children as props to uphold the image of the perfect mother, yet behind closed doors demanded unquestioning devotion to her ego, stripping them of any sense of personal autonomy. The professional world felt the weight of her steel resolve just as keenly. Crawford was a master of intrigue, capable of methodically destroying the careers of those who stood in her way. Her long-standing feud with Bette Davis became legendary, but beneath that rivalry lay a deep, almost tangible hatred that turned film sets into battlefields. Joan was relentless in her hunger for supremacy, using all her influence to manipulate producers and the press, creating a vacuum in which only she was allowed to shine. Her sinister power stemmed from the fact that she never stepped out of the role of the great actress, even when committing her most ruthless acts. Joan Crawford lived in a state of perpetual war with reality, attempting to bend it to her rigid designs. Her fanatical devotion to cleanliness and order was a shield against inner chaos, but for those around her it became a constant tension and fear. She proved that iron discipline can carry a person to the top, and that the same discipline can turn their life and the lives of those closest to them into a cold, airless tomb. Crawford remains in history as the Queen of Discipline, whose ominous perfectionism stands as a warning of what happens when ambition completely eclipses humanity. Erich von Stroheim. Erich von Stroheim entered Hollywood history under the nickname The Man You Love to Hate. His sinister reputation was built on his portrayals of arrogant Prussian officers, monocle in place and eyes frozen with contempt. But the true terror lay in his work on the other side of the camera. Von Stroheim was a director-dictator whose uncompromising nature and manic obsession with detail turned film productions into grueling sieges. He did not merely demand quality, he demanded total submission to his will, creating an atmosphere of psychological pressure on set that many actors recalled with shudders for the rest of their lives. Von Stroheim's ominous aura was further fed by his elaborate mystifications. He claimed to be an Austrian aristocrat of noble blood, when in reality he was the son of a hat-maker from a Vienna suburb. To sustain this fabricated image of von Stroheim, he behaved like a tyrant. During the filming of his legendary and notoriously ill-fated Greed, he forced actors to live for weeks in the unbearable heat of Death Valley, refusing to make the slightest concession to comfort.
He drove cast and crew to physical and nervous exhaustion, convinced that only through suffering could cinematic truth be achieved. His perfectionism bordered on madness. He ordered exorbitantly expensive silk underwear embroidered with coats of arms for the actors, fully aware it would never appear on screen, solely so they would feel like aristocrats. Professionally, von Stroheim was utterly unmanageable. He held budgets and schedules in open contempt, turning film productions into financial disasters for the studios. His clashes with producers such as Irving Thalberg became legendary. Von Stroheim could argue for hours over a single button on a uniform, while hundreds of extras stood waiting for his command. His sinister power lay in his inability or refusal to see people as individuals. To him, they were merely pigments on a canvas, tools for realizing his dark and often provocative visions. He filled his films with scenes of latent cruelty and decadence that scandalized the censors of the era. Erich von Stroheim ultimately became a victim of his own menacing persona. In the end, studios, exhausted by his despotism and reckless spending, stripped him of the chance to direct, leaving him only acting roles. Yet even as an actor, he carried onto the screen the same aura of intimidating superiority that had once made entire studios tremble. His life stands as a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of artistic perfection can harden into a totalitarian regime, where one man is willing to sacrifice everyone else for the sake of his grand illusion. Hollywood remembers him as the great dictator, his monocle reflecting the cold gleam of ambition without mercy.
Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's name is forever bound to the image of Count Dracula, yet his true menace lay not in cinematic fangs, but in the way that image slowly and relentlessly erased his real identity. Lugosi was a Hungarian intellectual and a serious stage actor, but Hollywood transformed him into a living symbol of the nightmare. His ominous accent, rigid expressions, and piercing gaze became both his trademark and his curse. Over time, the line between actor and character began to dissolve. Lugosi became a captive of his own shadow, living in a world where reality was inseparable from Gothic scenery, while he himself turned into a haunting ghost of former greatness. Lugosi's unsettling nature revealed itself in his inability to step out of character. Legends circulated through Hollywood that he would receive journalists while lying in a coffin, or wander the streets at night in his iconic black cape, terrifying unsuspecting passers-by. This obsession was not a clever publicity stunt, but a symptom of a deep personal crisis. Bela became uncontrollable in his need to embody the image of the Lord of Darkness. His arrogance and pride prevented him from adapting to the shifting demands of the film industry, and when the era of classic movie monsters faded, he found himself isolated, surrounded only by memories of his grim fame. The actor's sinister aura in the final decades of his life was fueled by physical and psychological collapse. Trying to numb the pain of obscurity and old injuries, Lugosi developed a dependence on powerful medications. This reduced him to a hollow version of himself, unpredictable, unsettling, and more frightening than pitiable to those around him. He continued to play dark figures in low-budget horror films, where his genuine exhaustion was passed off as performance. His collaboration with the infamous director Ed Wood became the final act of this tragedy. Lugosi portraying distorted caricatures of himself, drifting through a fog of illusions and addiction. Bela Lugosi spent his final years in a state of perpetual night, rarely leaving his darkened home. His death became the logical conclusion of the legend. By his own request, he was buried wearing Dracula's costume. He proved that sometimes a mask can fuse so tightly to the face that it can only be removed with the skin beneath it. Lugosi remains in Hollywood's memory as a man who did not merely play evil, but allowed it to consume his fate, becoming an eternal prisoner of the very nightmare he once gave to the world.
Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck was a woman Hollywood called Steel Flint. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she needed no tantrums or theatrical displays to dominate a room. One glance from her cold, penetrating eyes was enough. Stanwyck had come through a brutal school of life, beginning her career as a chorus dancer and clawing her way to the top through iron discipline and a complete absence of sentimentality. Her menace was an inner, restrained force that made her characters in films like Double Indemnity genuinely terrifying. She embodied the image of a woman capable of any decision so long as it was dictated by logic, profit, or survival. Stanwyck's ominous reputation within the industry was built on her uncompromising professionalism, which at times bordered on moral tyranny. She was relentless in her demands for excellence, both from herself and from everyone around her. On set, she was feared more than the strictest directors. Barbara tolerated no weakness, laziness, or incompetence. There were instances when she reduced young actresses or makeup artists to tears with nothing more than her cold, contemptuous silence, a weapon far more devastating than any outburst. She was a master of psychological distance. No one could claim to truly know what lived behind the eyes of this Iron Lady. That impenetrability created an aura of latent threat, leaving people uneasy in her presence. In her private life, Stanwyck displayed the same hardness that defined her career. Her marriages and relationships often resembled business arrangements or tactical alliances. She was someone who deliberately burned away any trace of vulnerability. When her marriage to Robert Taylor collapsed, she accepted it with chilling composure, continuing to work as if nothing had happened. Her sinister strength lay in her ability to shut down emotion entirely in pursuit of her goals. Hollywood whispered that Barbara never forgot a slight and knew how to take revenge with cold calculation, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. She was the queen of noir not simply because she played femme fatales, but because she embodied that aesthetic herself, beautiful, calculating, and lethally dangerous. Barbara Stanwyck lived a long life, remaining a benchmark of professionalism while never allowing anyone into her inner world. She proved that a woman in Hollywood could be stronger and harder than any man if she was willing to sacrifice softness for steel armor. Stanwyck remains in history as a woman of stone whose dark gleam was the result of decades spent grinding her character against ruthless competition. She stood as a living reminder that the most frightening danger is not the one that shouts, but the one that remains silent and moves methodically toward its goal, indifferent to obstacles and to the feelings of others. Richard Burton. Richard Burton possessed a voice critics called the sound of molten gold, and a talent capable of commanding any audience from Broadway to Hollywood. Yet behind this majestic facade lurked a sinister, deeply destructive nature that turned his life and the lives of those who loved him into an endless drama forever teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Burton was a man of colossal passions and equally colossal vices. His darkness was neither quiet nor hidden. It was a raging, thunderous force that swept everything aside. He was uncontrollable in his self-destruction, and that dark energy made his presence in any room feel physically heavy, almost unbearable. Burton's ominous aura was inseparable from his long and turbulent union with Elizabeth Taylor. Their relationship, famously dubbed the romance of the century, often resembled prolonged warfare. Burton had a frightening ability to transform from a tender intellectual into a furious tyrant. Witnesses recalled their arguments as something beyond reason: screaming matches, priceless porcelain smashed to pieces, and psychological duels that could last for days. Richard wielded his razor-sharp intellect and flawless command of language as weapons, inflicting the deepest possible emotional wounds. His menace lay in the fact that he understood his power and reveled in the chaos he unleashed, as if testing both the world and the people around him for their breaking point. Burton's professional path bore the same mark of inner darkness. He despised the actor's craft, considering it unworthy of a man, and this self-loathing spilled over onto colleagues and directors alike. He could derail the filming of a multi-million-dollar production because of a sudden surge of melancholy or rage. His uncontrollable lifestyle, fueled by staggering amounts of alcohol, turned his final years into a grim spectacle of collapse. He would step onto the stage or in front of the camera, barely able to stand, yet still radiating that demonic charisma that made audiences watch in equal parts horror and awe. He was a man who deliberately burned his life like a candle at both ends, indifferent to those who might be scorched by the flames. Richard Burton remains in history as one of the greatest and at the same time most unsettling actors of his era. His darkness was tragic in nature, the fury of a fallen angel who could never forgive himself for his own imperfections. He proved that the most beautiful voice in the world can hurl the most terrifying curses, and that the brightest star can become a black hole, devouring everything around it. Burton departed, leaving behind the myth of a world destroyer, a man who never managed to tame his demons and instead allowed them to rule his fate until the very end.
Our list of the most ominous figures of the Golden Age concludes with a man whose appearance became synonymous with latent pathology and quiet, insinuating madness. Peter Lorre achieved worldwide fame with his role in M, where he portrayed a character who inspired both terror and icy revulsion. His distinctive look, short stature, enormous eyes seemingly frozen in eternal fear or rapture, and a soft, almost feminine voice created an image impossible to erase from memory. In Hollywood, Lorre became trapped in the role of the intellectual maniac, yet his real life was steeped in an equally sinister atmosphere of addiction and psychological disintegration, making him one of the darkest figures behind the scenes. Lorre's ominous aura was fueled by his complete lack of control over his own health and habits. Early in his European career, he became addicted to morphine, a dependency that followed him for decades and left a disturbing imprint on his behavior. Colleagues recalled that working with him was physically unsettling. Lorre could sit motionless for hours, staring at a single point, only to suddenly erupt into a quiet, blood-chilling laugh. His menace lay in the contrast between his fragile appearance and the abyss of darkness that seemed to inhabit every movement. He did not shout or wave his fists. He frightened with his calm, behind which one sensed a readiness for the most unpredictable acts. Professionally, Lorre often used his sinister charisma to manipulate the atmosphere on set. He was a master of improvisation in the realm of quiet horror.
Directors noted that he could introduce a single, almost imperceptible detail into an ordinary scene, a strange gesture, or an unnaturally long pause that sent shivers down the spines of audiences and fellow actors alike. This ability to transmit inner instability made him indispensable in noir films and horror pictures. Off-camera, however, Lorre frequently sank into deep melancholy and detachment. His Hollywood home was described as a place filled with strange artifacts and heavy, oppressive energy, where the actor hid from the world, descending into the very nightmares he portrayed so convincingly on screen. Peter Lorre lived as a man who saw what others preferred not to notice. His menace was not theatrical, but existential, a fear of human nature itself, carried deep within him. He proved that the most terrifying monster is not the one endowed with great strength, but the one who looks at you with the eyes of a frightened child while concealing bottomless darkness behind them. Lorre departed, leaving behind a gallery of cinema's most disturbing images and the memory of a man whose face became an international code for quiet, relentless evil, always nearby, always waiting in the shadows.
As we conclude our descent into the abyss of the Golden Age, we are forced to acknowledge that Hollywood's history is not merely a chronicle of triumph and glamour, but also a record of profound human collapse. We have traced 10 lives, each steeped in darkness, concealed behind the facade of a flawless image. This exploration has shown that the so-called dream factory was not designed to cultivate individuals, but to process them into commercial products where genuine human qualities, no matter how sinister, became nothing more than fuel for screen personas. Wallace Beery, Joan Crawford, Peter Lorre, and the others on our list were not simply actors. They were hostages of a system that rewarded their inner darkness as long as it generated profit. We discovered that behind every great film of that era looms an invisible shadow, the pain of broken colleagues, the fear of those closest to them, and the ruined lives of people who happened to cross the path of these untouchable idols. Hollywood in those years resembled a vast theater of shadows, where behind the blinding glare of the spotlights lurked sadism, manipulation, and an absolute unchecked arrogance. Most disturbing of all is the fact that audiences adored these figures for decades, unaware that their idols were, in reality, the embodiment of the very vices their screen heroes claimed to oppose. These 10 stars proved that success and the adoration of millions can become the perfect refuge for those whose nature knows no limits in its destructive impulse. We watched talent turn into an instrument of tyranny and charisma into a weapon of psychological annihilation. The Golden Age has passed, leaving behind an invaluable legacy preserved on film. But today, we have pulled back the velvet curtain and seen the reverse side. Filthy secrets, crimes quietly buried, and the cold calculations of studio moguls who preferred to unleash monsters as long as the box office stayed full. These stories serve as a stark reminder that human nature is far more complex than any screenplay, and that in the pursuit of immortality on screen, many of these legends lost their humanity in real life. Our investigation is complete. Now that you know what darkness fed the light of these stars, classic cinema will forever carry a bitter aftertaste of truth. Remember, when the screen goes dark, the real monsters do not vanish. They simply return to their lavish mansions to continue their sinister game behind closed doors, where there are no directors, only their own will, unchecked and absolute.